Welcome to another episode of Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindy Baldy, and this is my husband and co-host, Jeffrey Tumlin.
Yellow! Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. Today we wanted to announce that we're going to try a live stream coming up. It'll be on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, 2025. So if you can, grab your margarita and we'll talk some management. Today we would like to ask you for a little bit of feedback. So to make that conversation interesting to you, we're looking for what is currently challenging you at work, either managing yourself or managing others. You can leave them down in the comments section, or you can check the show notes and we'll have a link to where you can leave us some of your ideas for that conversation. Now on to the show. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. I am your host, Cindy Baldy, and my co-host, Jeffrey Tumlin.
Yellow.
He's just across the way. And today we're going to talk about how sometimes our idea of leadership can jack us up.
Yeah. How what we think is actually not only wrong, but unhelpful.
Yeah. Can actually cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, it goes all the way back. I got a story for this one.
Okay.
It goes all the way back to when I first started teaching leadership years ago. And we used to talk about, I guess in the 40s, it started this idea, they called it great man theory or trait theory, that there were certain traits that you needed to be a good leader. And usually that involved being male and being tall and being athletic, all these kind of antiquated notions.
And competitive.
Yeah.
And aggressive.
Type A, all this. And so I used to show, there's a scene in Braveheart where Mel Gibson is trying to rally the troops, and it's literally a leader riding in on a horse to save the day at the critical moment in this scene where he's trying to convince the Scottish people to fight against the English. Anyway, as a kind of caricature, this is what, if we're not careful, we think leadership is. But it's not about somebody riding in to save the day and, making everything better and go away. That's not what leaders do. And it was years and years of debunking, where basically when science got interested in leadership, of trying to figure out, okay, well, what does actually predict leadership effectiveness? And basically it's none of the things from trait leadership. It's not your height. It's not whether you're a man. It's not whether you're athletic. It's not whether you're aggressive. It's actually none of those things. You can be a great leader with the opposite of those characteristics, depending on the particular environment that you're leading in. Basically, a lot of the things we think about leadership are wrong. Somebody's going to come in, they're going to know just what to do, they're going to save the day. And too often, historically, we've thought of that person as being basically a man or somebody confident and handsome and articulate.
And this is how we get basically, a bunch of men at the top of organizations who have a tendency to score high on narcissistic personalities.
Yeah, I forget that. I forget who
That's
that
Hambrick.
researcher is.
That's Hambrick.
That's Hambrick?
Yeah.
From
Dartmouth
Michigan?
at the time.
Dartmouth.
I don't know where he is today,
Michigan?
but he was in Dartmouth when he wrote it.
That was Hambrick's research?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, just somebody, this is inside baseball, somebody I guess Cindy is loosely acquainted with.
Yeah, I met him.
Yeah. Anyway, those researchers that I forget the gist, maybe you know the gist, but basically in the population, 5% of the people, and I'm making this up, 5% of the people are narcissists, but if you evaluate CEOs, it's something like 20%.
It's disproportionate.
20 or something like that.
Which
25.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, like, to believe that you can be at the top of these organizations. Many of the organizations are, I think he actually studied specifically the top 500. So like it was maybe Forbes 500 or something like that. So you're talking about like the biggest organizations in the world, potentially. And to believe that you can be at the top of those and make them better probably does require some degree of narcissism, So that is what he found. He found that, based on the measures that he used. And this is not a disorder that he was using. It's just a personality. So it's a spectrum personality where, the general belief is that everybody has some narcissism. It's a dimension.
Sure.
But the people at the top of these organizations typically scored high on narcissism.
Yeah. If we kind of go back to where I was talking at the beginning, it's been a long time, but I would show that Mel Gibson Braveheart clip as kind of a parody of, look, this can't be real, right? I mean, meaning this can't be what we think leaders need to be, because our organizations are so diverse. We need all kinds of leadership. And then I would follow up with the research basically showing that the three...
It's mostly skills that can be learned.
Yeah.
The three that seem to matter the most are intelligence, which that you are born with some propensity.
Yep.
Although good nutrition and health helps that.
Sleep.
Yeah, and sleep. And
helps
then,
you be able to access it.
Yeah. And then communication skills.
Yep.
And then emotional intelligence.
Yep. Yeah. That basically Cindi just summarized, I don't know,
decades of
50
research.
years of research of what are the traits of effective leaders. Well, there really aren't any. You can, depending on how you're leading, you need different things, but 3 meta competencies or super traits, sometimes they call them, seem to help, which she just articulated.
But the emotional intelligence and the communication, those are skills that can be learned. So they're not really traits.
Yeah, your basic leadership in general is enhanced by IQ, communication ability, and as you said, EQ, or sometimes people talk about that as self-awareness, self-reflection.
Well, EQ is bigger than that, though.
Yeah, sure. I think self-reflection is one part of
it is, but
EQ.
Then there's the part where you're actually able to
meet them,
help others manage their emotions.
Yeah.
And that's actually a really important piece of the EQ equation when it comes to leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that was challenging for me when I was teaching about leadership is that I would then go out and look for movies that didn't show that kind of leadership. And that's a little bit harder lift.
They exist, but like movies are a reflection of our culture. Yeah. And so, that's why, like these days we're having fun, not you so much because you're not really all that into movies, but it's somewhat fun to go back and watch like a movie that was your favorite in the 80s and then be like, my Lord, that was awful. Like that like what it says about us in the 80s is just terrifying. Yeah. And so, like the movies of the day that are about leadership, they are a reflection of sort of the collective mindset of what a leader is supposed to look like. Yeah. And it may be like a method, actually, if you aren't really super clear about like what is in your head and whether it's healthy, it may help you to actually sort of look at leadership movies and look at the behaviors that, they're sort of upholding as, hey, this is a great leader. And, is that actually healthy? Is that actually a healthy way for somebody to lead? Because a lot of the time it's really, like you said, it's rushing in. It's, which, does sort of imply perhaps some neglect, right? Previously.
Sure. Right.
And it's, having the right answers, which implies that the human mind could have, as an individual, the best answers, when the research generally is like, look, like the world is pretty complex and probably better off putting a whole group of people on a task to think through how to handle something. you're generally going to get a better solution. And so that construct of what a leader is that we see in movies, which is largely a reflection of our collective mind, may not be what you really want. You may want actually the leadership shown by like Stand and Deliver, which is an old movie, fantastic movie, of this teacher who basically takes people, a bunch of students who nobody believed in, and had them pass the AP exams. And that is, I think, a pretty good movie. I mean, I'm going off memory here, but it's pretty good movie in terms of like, leadership and like having a vision and then helping people see that they can be part of that vision and then supporting them as they start to waver in actually moving towards that vision. And then when things go wrong, having their back.
Right.
And so I think that was probably, from a functional standpoint, probably one of the better movies on leadership that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah. I think it makes sense. Our work corroborates the science, which is there's no typology of effective leadership, that it takes all kinds. And we see, even we work in the same industry, we have a lot of clients in healthcare and fire departments and a decent chunk in city governments. Those chief executives they're all different, even though they're doing within category the same type of job. And so that's our experience is borne out what the science says.
Right. And I think that one of the reasons why we want to talk about this is because the construct, this idea of leadership in our heads, sometimes leads us to discriminate against groups in terms of opportunities, which that's a problem. I'm not sure that we necessarily need to go into the specifics of why that's a problem, but that's a problem. That's one reason for us to...
it makes sense, right? You want as much representation as you can get of different viewpoints, and you want to pick the best candidate. And so any kind of bias is hurting
you from doing that. Yes.
And you want the best candidate in whatever role you're hiring for.
Sure.
So, it's not mysterious.
We should be choosing the best people.
Best. Yeah.
And as soon as we are basically narrowing that down to a race, a gender, or race and gender, and then a subset of personality traits.
Yes.
We're limiting in a very narrow.
Yeah. And most people
pond.
aren't saying, I want to pick a white man to be my CEO. What's happening is that as you're explaining, and I'll let you finish this out, but basically we're going in with, as much as we think it's funny to think about, we're going in with the Mel Gibson Braveheart.
Yeah, it's a preconceived
in
notion.
Our head.
Yeah, it's a preconceived notion.
I want the decisive person that's going to ride up on the horse and make this better.
Right. It's preconceived, and then it's further exacerbated by movies, and it's almost like a vicious cycle, right? Like, part of the reason why the tendency, like when you ask people to like close their eyes and think of the best leader that they can think of, the reason why there's a tendency that it comes up to be white men is because those are the people we have historically given opportunities to be leaders. And so then you have a vicious cycle of their example in their head. And that person may have been a great leader, maybe, or maybe that person heavily exemplified this construct in your head of what a great leader is, which may actually not be a great leader, like Mel Gibson example. But either way, what you have in your head as like examples tend to be white men, and that begets more white men. And so we have to really think about our limitations on how we're thinking of leadership. And if that is impacting exactly like what you said, like our biases in terms of selecting. Sometimes we are selecting not because we're intentionally trying to discriminate, but we just feel more comfortable with the person who looks like the construct.
Yeah. This isn't necessarily the, stop hiring white male podcast. This is.
No, I'm not saying that.
Yeah, because
it would greatly limit your opportunities.
That's
and
right.
I'm all for your opportunities.
Hire one at least.
I just want mine too.
Yeah, just this white male. Yeah. But it's bigger than that. It's if you're in tech, you have in your head that I'm hiring, I don't know, a nerd, or
yes.
I'm hiring.
It's that construct.
Yeah.
If you're hiring somebody in an IT, department, and we know a lot of people in IT departments, and we love them, and they don't actually fulfill the stereotype. But the stereotype is, like the super task-oriented, somewhat antisocial person you're going to be able to pick up the phone and they're going to be able to fix your technology problems. Yeah. When actually we have seen fantastic IT people who are, super social and, they get the job done because there is definitely a heavy task focus with IT, but they're not remiss on forming social relationships. And so if you have the stereotype in your head, then maybe you're not very comfortable with the person who comes in and actually demonstrates social skills, but you're trying to implement new technology. And that is exactly the person you need. You need the person who is going to run around and be happy to help everybody and, somewhat roll with any uncertainty that rolling out technology is.
Yep. Yeah, it reminds me of the story of the founder of Ritz-Carlton, Horst Schultz, founder of Ritz-Carlton, and they have bellmen at all the Ritz-Carltons, and that's like the first person you see, and so that's a very important position. And yet there's a lot of wide variation in the performance of the bellman and what people think of them. Not the bellman, the front door. I don't think it's called bellman.
You're talking about like the check-in desk?
No, the person outside opening the door. Doorman?
Doorman, I think is maybe the better.
But the person actually.
Yeah, the greeter.
Yeah. And so basically Schultz had the insight that these people really matter, but we have no idea how. And so he got some academic or somebody to actually study. It's like Cindi and I talk all the time, and Cindi alerted me to this years ago. You never want to hire based on a personality assessment unless you know exactly what predicts success in that position. And if you're listening to this podcast, your company hasn't done that. Guaranteed.
No, it's a statistical analysis and it requires a lot of data.
Yeah, that you actually don't know what makes a good clinic manager, what makes a good hotel operator, what makes a good cashier at Taco Bell. And that you haven't actually done that analysis of going and finding the people who do the job well and the people who don't, analyze the differences, and then actually, if there are findings, there may not be findings, but if you have findings, then all right, this is what makes for somebody very good on the register at Taco Bell. They need X, Y, and Z, and here's the data to prove that. And that's why Cindi and I never recommend assessments to hire people. You can use them as part of a multi-pronged approach to get an insight on people. But unless you're actually doing unique analysis for your company and for that position, it's insane to think that you have any accurate way of knowing what predicts success in that position. So they ran this analysis.
So that's only like personality traits. Like you do know that they have to have a certain skill set. And so making sure that they have that skill set, that's different.
Yeah. But what's embedded in the job.
Right. And you could teach it potentially. So
I would say you should still, if you were going to be precise, you should still study that. Because we'll do this exercise in groups. I'll get back to my Ritz-Carlton story in a minute, but we do this exercise in groups all the time. They're hiring a picket, whatever. They're hiring a new office manager in a medical practice. Okay, write down on a note card, what are the competencies that this office manager should have to be successful in this clinic? What should they be able to do? What are the things? And they won't have the same list. People won't have the same list for what that should be. And when they do, it's still worth asking, how do you know? How do you know this to be true? Is it just that you're remembering the one you had to fire? And so you're overcorrecting?
Possibly.
And now, right now, at this moment, you think the opposite of what the other person had is what you need? And that's going to change?
Hello, musers. Now it's time for commercial break.
All right, strategic planning. Here's what works best. You get your core group of people. We gather them for 9 sessions. You add your board, if you have one, to a couple of the sessions. You add some of your other leaders and employees for feedback to a couple of the sessions. Halfway through, we have a drafted strategic plan. It's actually strategic, which means it gives you some kind of comparative advantage. And then by the end, by the 9th session, you're final on the strategic plan, guide you for between 2 and 3 years. Most strategic plans aren't strategic. They're just a list of things you want to accomplish in the next few years. Don't let that happen to your strategic plan. We've spent years figuring out how can you get a group of senior executives to actually isolate on the key drivers of what makes a company better in a way that can't be replicated by its competitors. Call us, ondemandleadership.com, and we'll put the strategy in your strategic planning. And so back to this Ritz-Carlton. So Schultz got somebody to do this analysis of all the doormen, the door people, I don't know what they call them, men and women. And
Door person.
what they found that was actually statistically significant was that the best of these were gardeners. Because gardeners love taking care of things and they love being outside. And they're willing to invest in the long term. And I love this story because, one, you never know.
Yeah, we didn't see that coming.
Didn't see it coming. And two, you have to do the research to act. Otherwise, you think, what's a doorman? Well, it needs to be a man, needs to be tall, right? I mean, and so we're back to hiring people based on
A construct.
Yeah.
That's never been tested.
Braveheart on a horse. I want a tall person standing by the door, who looks good in the uniform. That's actually not significant to likely to be a good doorman at the whatever it was, Ritz-Carlton. And so I think I can speak for both of us in our experience. Leadership actually matters an enormous amount. Picking who you pick for the CEO.
Oh, yeah.
And other key parts of company matters to check. If you're a CEO, who you pick to be your kind of core staff, your core leadership team, that is gigantic impact on you, the company, and kind of the pathway of your tenure at the company. But a lot of times we have subconsciously and even explicitly in our head an idea of what we think this person should look like and sound like and be like. And that's not.
And periodically we need to check in to make sure that that isn't actually a screwed up concept.
Yep.
That's not actually healthy.
Yep.
And we need to do that on the side of hiring, but we also need to do that for ourselves. And so this is, the second reason that we're talking about this is that when you take on a new role, oftentimes you have, I'm going to call it imposter syndrome, although imposter syndrome is probably not entirely used properly. This idea that you're taking on a new role. And so you feel like you're an imposter. And so you fake it to make it, you fake it for a little while to make it. Well, the issue with what we're talking about with constructs and leadership is if you are put into a leadership role and your construct of what a leader is flawed, then you're going to be faking a flawed construct.
Right.
And so like that gets into the Zimbardo study in Stanford, the Stanford prison experiment, where they made some students prisoners and some students the guards. And the guards, because they had a construct in their head of what guards would be like, like
Sure.
tough guys, not taking crap from anybody, and, allowed to be fairly physically abusive, then they wound up having these college students who knew they were playing a role start exhibiting these behaviors because the construct was flawed. And so when you are taking a leadership position, you really need to explore your construct of leadership, because especially in the very beginning, you are going to be faking it. So make sure you're faking it based on a healthy construct of leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Reminds me of one of our mentors, Howard Prince, the late great Howard Prince. They told me a story about being in Vietnam, and it was during the time period where he was an infantry captain, and the average tour in Vietnam was, I think, 13 months, but the life expectancy for an infantry captain was 9 months. And he'd already been injured once, and he was in another few weeks would be injured so bad it took a year to rehab. But his battalion commander was killed. And so basically their boss, died in combat. And so they flew in a new boss, and they're still in the middle of the woods. People are dying, right? And the new boss gathers the other captains, the company commanders. Basically, it's the battalion commander is the boss, and then the company commanders are the subordinate leaders. That's like the leadership team, basically, in a battalion. And Howard said the first thing that he said, he has like kind of this, deep, rumbly voice, is like, "Okay, all right, man, good to meet you. Just one thing, so we're clear. I'm terrified, and I assume you are too. So now that we got that out of the way, let's figure out how we're going to do this thing." And Prince said it was just such a relief to have the boss acknowledge he's terrified too, right? And this is not the normal script of a leader.
No, and especially not a military leader.
Not the normal script of a military leader in combat. But it was the first thing that Vought, this guy said. And this isn't a podcast about going against type or doing the opposite. It's a podcast about trying to meet the moment that you're in a way that is likely, if you're a leader, to be effective for the people you're leading and the work you're trying to do. And what was effective in that moment for that incoming battalion commander who was taking over for a guy who'd just been killed in combat was to basically acknowledge to his leaders, "I'm as scared as you are, but we're going to figure this out. Let's go." That's the power of getting outside of the
construct. The common construct.
Yeah. The predetermined. A clinic manager should be like this. The people manning our cash register should be like this. Really? How do you know? It's worth more thinking. And typically, the research in our experience would back up you being able to have a more expansive array of personalities doing the same job.
Yeah, generally speaking,
Yeah.
in management, the personality component, because it's often in many studies, it's often a control in many studies. It just isn't significant, with the exception of conscientiousness and sometimes extroversion.
Yeah.
But it's only sometimes extroversion. And we've seen extroverts actually excel in spots that you would think on the surface would be a bad fit. And so, generally speaking, these personality traits just don't really materialize.
Yeah, I mean, it's Adam Grant's work on, I can't remember if it's in Give and Take or Originals, which those are his name of 2 of his books, but that came
And they're good
from
books.
research that he did, where I don't know if I can get it perfectly right, but basically in his work, introversion works a little better if the group is already highly formed.
Well, yeah, they don't need somebody in their shorts.
Because they don't need a lot of that.
I think that's also mirrored in Quiet.
Could
Susan
be.
Cain's book.
Susan Cain. Yeah.
I think she says, like, unless it's a period of great change where you need somebody who's going to do a lot of like communicating naturally, then an introvert leader actually has a lot of benefits.
Yeah. We're summarizing decades of research on this, but basically, there was a time period we're looking at some of the core personality measures. Cindi mentioned introversion, extroversion, and conscientiousness.
They're called the big 5 in total.
Yeah. Yes, that those 2, there seemed to be a slight advantage to being a little more extroverted for leadership and a slight advantage to being more conscientious. But more recent research, I think, has at least made the case that you're, like, as you said, and from the Susan Cain or Adam Grant, whoever originated the research about introverts actually have a lot of natural strengths going for them in leading well-established teams and others. And you and I, we've seen
some of our favorites.
Countless introverts, just exceptional leaders. And so I'm past the point of thinking that traits matter to leadership. And I'm not sure about you.
Oh, yeah.
I think you can have an almost infinite array of traits and be an effective leader. It's a question of, as I've said before, meeting the moment and providing your team what they need to be able to carry forward with the work.
To me, it seems like it's a little bit of a difference between style versus substance.
Cat and no handle. Hat and no cattle. What'd I say? Cat and no hattle.
Yeah, that's good. That's
all
like,
hat and no cattle.
That's like black clack or whatever.
Black cat. Black clack.
Yeah.
All hat and no cattle.
Yeah. So, like the personality in that regard is like the style, but you don't necessarily need a particular style. You need substance, and the substance is how well do you communicate with individuals, on an interpersonal level? How well do you communicate a vision? How adept are you at emotional intelligence? Can you manage your own emotions? Can you manage other people's emotions? So that is just like a deeper level of work than showing up and, hi, I am who I am.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree with that. You want to work on yourself as a leader. And if you're looking for Cindy's and Geoff's tips to be a better leader based on the science, it would be take care of your brain, good sleep, good eat, good exercise, etc., because the IQ seems to matter. Make sure that you're trying to continually hone your communication skills and your persuasion, because getting your point across really seems to matter. And that jives with our experience in leadership. The higher you go, the more you have to be good at virtually everything as it comes to communication. Meaning be able to bounce from one group to another, a small group to a big group, to one upset employee, to 3 people who don't know you, et cetera. And then the last thing is work on managing your emotions. Work on helping other people manage theirs. Take an inventory of the things that still are in development in yourself and see what you can do to make them better. That's the EQ part. And that's how you increase your effectiveness as a leader. And then pay attention to what's going on and try to meet the moment you find yourself in. And it's a gamble. There's no sure thing.
Yeah, but those help up the odds.
Yep.
That you'll be successful.
Tilt them in your favor.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think your point about faking it until you make it is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, when we're in the learning curve, it's nerve-wracking. And we have a unique vantage point that we're coaching senior people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they're as nervous as anyone about, am I getting this right? Could I be doing better, et cetera? And it's very powerful to hear somebody in a position of authority say, look, here's some mistakes I've made along the way. Here's some things I'm working on trying to get better, because it's a reminder to everybody else that they're not imposters. Nobody's an imposter. And everybody's trying to learn. And we're often thrown into jobs that we have some preparation for, but never enough. And so everybody feels like this.
I mean, and you kind of want it that way. Like, you know,
It's a stretch, yeah.
if you're only doing exactly what you know how to do, most of us are going to get bored.
Yeah.
Which is why, like, the typical lifespan of an employee is, at 7 years, they start to get restless.
What's the science on that?
I saw it in an HBR article. I haven't looked at the actual study, but that's about typical. I guess you would call that the 7-year itch, right? Like that.
Well, I mean, I know of that from marriage.
I know. I think it's kind of the same thing. Like you start to feel like you're in a rut if like things aren't changing, a pretty good degree in offering new challenges. And so we want those challenges to be able to feel like we're progressing, most of us.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering though, I have to look at that article, the methodology. I mean, a lot of people that we coach in 7 years, their jobs have dramatically transformed.
Right. And so you don't have the same thing. I think the transformation changes that.
Yeah.
Because you're always having to adapt, essentially. I mean, not constantly, but, periodically you're having to adapt and take on new things.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a restart on the job.
Yeah. Yeah. We had a guy, amazing guy, and he one day, like middle of the night, sends me this long email. I heard about this imposter syndrome, and I think that's me. I feel like at any moment, people will uncover that I don't know what I'm doing and this and that. And the guy basically had done amazing things in his career, and he kept taking big gambles, big, risks, but he was largely able to pull them off. And like, I just wrote the guy back, and I said, everybody feels this way. You're taking gigantic risks. I'd be worried if you didn't occasionally have these feelings. That's not imposter syndrome. I read an article probably a year ago about the people who popularized that term. Now they're even walking back, because syndrome sounds like it's clinical, right? Like I've got this syndrome, like metabolic syndrome.
I feel like it's just a phase. It should be imposter phase or something. I don't know.
And I feel like it should just be learning curve.
Yeah.
Like our greatest service for this podcast may be, if you're feeling like that's me, I'm an imposter. And
ask yourself, are you just in a learning curve?
That's right. We coach people who other people look to as having the answers. And when we close the door, they'll admit that there is nervous about, do I even have the right questions as anybody else?
And that goes hand in hand with leadership and rising in an organization, because as you rise, you do less technical and you do more abstract.
Yeah.
And so you're never going to know for sure exactly, are you doing the right thing? Are you asking the right questions? Because it's just abstract. You have to be, and maybe this is the other thing that I think determines leadership effectiveness, is your ability to handle uncertainty, because uncertainty has an impact on your decisions. It has an impact on your risk propensity. It has an impact on what you identify with.
Yeah.
And so, you have to be pretty good at not letting it become the driver of your decisions.
Yep. Yep. That makes sense.
All right. Thanks for joining us today on Management Muse, and thanks for all the people helping to support us to make this thing happen. So we appreciate Design at Work and Rebecca and Sarah and Christina. I think I got everybody. Thank you.
Yep.
And we appreciate if you are so moved. We appreciate likes and follows and comments.
Yep, all of it.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on Management Muse. We are a podcast / YouTube channel that we hope is entertaining and educational. We are management and communication professionals working in the field, but also have degrees that back us in science. All that being said, we are talking in generalities on this podcast. We do not actually know your particular situation. So proceed with common sense and maybe a little bit of experimentation on your end. And we hope that you make the world a more beautiful place by making work a more enjoyable place. See you next time on Management Muse.